If you have read The Hunger Games by Susan Collins, then you might be aware how it is very much laden with symbolism, especially when it comes to names. Some are more obvious than others, like the game maker Seneca Crane, whose ending mirrors that of his namesake. But while researching for a video essay I plan to do about Lucy Gray, the poem by William Wordsworth, and the character it inspired, I was looking into the symbolism of Hawthorne's, which obviously led me to thinking about Gale Hawthorne. In this video essay, I want to share what I found about the potential meaning behind Gale's last name and how it related to him as a character, then do the same with Peeta's last name, Mellark. So let's get started. The meaning and symbolism behind Hawthorne. For anyone unfamiliar, hawthorns are a type of plant. Actually, they are trees, and this plant can be found in many works of literature, plays, and poems because of its symbolism. For example, often hawthorns represent love and fertility, spring, new life, protection, and even optimism. And despite their unpleasant smell, the flowers of this tree symbolize all types of love. The latter bit actually reminded me of Gale. Katniss described how they started off cold and distant, reluctant at first to work together in order to increase their chance of survival, but a love develops between them over time. It is, however, up to debate whether it is familiar, platonic, or romantic love. As I have previously mentioned, hawthorns are popular for symbolism. For example, Shakespeare mentions the plant in 5 of his plays. Often he refers to all parts of the plant, such as its branch, the flowers, and even its thorns. A part of Katniss's relationship arc with Gale was coming to terms with every part of him. She could see herself with him because together they offered stability and safety. This would be maybe a representation of the branch, since branches can be thick and sturdy, and in Katniss's case, a place where she hid and even slept on during the 74th Hunger Games because that was where she was safest. Gale saw and acknowledged all parts of Katniss, including inner feelings like anger and uncertainty, and loved her for it. He also saw it as potentially more than a partnership, more romantic, as we saw in Catching Fire and Mockingjay. These I consider his flowers. These traits budded throughout their relationship and added something to it more than just, say, being a coworker. But Gale also has thorns, and that is his anger and his idea of justice, and Katniss has to decide if she is okay with them or not. We do see very early on Katniss leaning away from Gale's more rebellious talks and offerings to run away. She's angry for the same reasons as him, but she feels the weight of her mother and sister anchoring her to District 12. She cannot delude herself that they would survive or even enjoy existing purely out in the wilderness alone. Though in a moment of terror and desperation, she briefly does in Catching Fire, but it does not last long. And this is a part of the downfall of hers and Gale's relationship. Katniss is too practical. She is not like her mother, whose love for Katniss's father overrode his thorns, because we hear little tidbits of how Katniss's father was slightly rebellious, and how much it scared her mother when, for instance, he taught Katniss the Hanging Tree song. Yet despite that, his death devastated Katniss's mother because her love for him overrode practicality. She even was willing to give up her slightly more cushioned existence for this harder one. Similar to what Shakespeare does, we see sort of all parts of Gale and Katniss's relationship represented as every part of the Hawthorne plant. The symbolism for hawthorns doesn't end there. There's a lot of lore surrounding the particular plant, and the lore is mixed. It is both good and bad, a theme Susan Collins loves to use. In some of the lore, hawthorns represent love and lust, often being used on Beltane and for the May Queen, but it is also associated with weddings. The wood be used for torches while the flowers are a part of the crown. However, the meaning changes if you take this particular plant indoors. It is considered unlucky to bring it into your house. Some tales even believe to do so brings death to your mother. It is linked to witches being used to make up their brooms. It is also linked heavily to the Fae. But again, the folk represent both good and bad, light and dark. That is Gale. He is both. The best version of Gale I think we got to see in the book was when he was beyond the fence with Katniss. He becomes more gray when he is within the society's fence, and even worse when underground in District 13. Just as the Hawthorne plant represents something good when used outside in nature, but considered unlucky when brought in. Even Katniss recognizes this with her thought in Chapter 1 of Catching Fire. I think of Gale, who is only really alive in the woods, with its fresh air and sunlight and clean, flowing water. But outside its broader symbolic uses and its place in lore, the uses for the hawthorn plant also can be related back to Gale. For example, it makes for a good early foraging tree. Its young leaves are tender and sometimes called bread and cheese, despite having a somewhat nutty taste. They can be used fresh on fresh salads or shredded on boiled potatoes. You can add it to soups, stews, and stocks. The berries can be harvested in late summer and eaten straight, tasting like apples but not so sweet, or can be used for jellies and jams. AKA, Gale represents food. Working with him, Katniss admits that suddenly the two of them not only had enough food for their families, but enough to start trading in the hob. Yet, this is not a plant that you typically grow in your garden. It is a wild plant you forage for. Similar to how Gale doesn't seem like he grows and thrives within an enclosure, he thrived out in wild nature. And his and Katniss's love wasn't fostered under a careful, confined eye, not like hers and Peeta's, but rather flourished during their time out in wild nature. Also, as I previously stated, the hawthorn is a good or early foraging tree. Gale was good for Katniss in her early development. She needed someone like him to come into her life to show that there are other capable people around her. Someone who sees and interacts with the world sort of like she does. For example, they both lost their fathers young, both came from the same neighborhood, both had to feed and support their families, and they shared this mutual give and take relationship. The reason why Katniss was uncomfortable around Peeta for so long was because she felt like she owed him for saving her all those years ago, and he didn't expect anything in return. With Gale, the scale was always balanced. But as Katniss also admits, Gale helped teach her more ways to hunt and gather for food than she knew. And he also provided her with a person she could truly talk to. To quote Katniss from the opening chapter, Gale gave me a sense of security I'd lacked since my father's death. His companionship replaced the long solitary hours in the woods. I became a much better hunter when I didn't have to look over my shoulder constantly, when someone was watching my back. Being out in the woods with Gale, sometimes I was actually happy. She also thinks to herself upon our first introduction to Gale. In the woods waits the only person with whom I can be myself. The sight of him waiting there brings on a smile. Gale says I never smile except in the woods. Katniss probably would not have thrived as much as she was, which isn't saying much, but in comparison, without Gale helping her over those years. This helped increase her chances in the games, but also their relationship helped to open her up to others. Yes, she was sort of a close clam when it came to Peeta and Haymitch, but she probably would have been 1,000 times worse if her relationship with Gale hadn't incrementally helped her open up. So, as you can see, there are a lot of similarities between the character of Gale Hawthorne and the plant his name might have been inspired by. By looking at these examples of the plant's symbolism in other works of literature and seeing the lore from folk tales and even the plant's actual uses, we get this opportunity to step back and look at his character and his relationship with Katniss maybe a little differently. I personally don't think Susan Collins intended for us to villainize him as much as the fandom has over these years. I personally think he was a good person, but Collins is showing how war can change people. It changed Gale, giving him more wiggle room to justify certain actions, but it also changed Katniss, making her into someone new, and this new person no longer meshed with the new version of Gale. Though, knowing fandom, I doubt this has changed many people's minds. So let's move on to analyzing Peeta's last name. The meaning and symbolism behind Mellark. As I previously mentioned, in my opinion, Susan Collins puts a lot of attention to naming her characters. I believe they often can tell us a lot about the character's journey, but also what they might possibly represent. But here's the thing, Mellark is a bit harder to analyze than, say, Hawthorne. Now, Peeta's name is an obvious representation of bread and him being a baker, etc., but Mellark, well, I can't find much. I think it's a real last name. Please tell me if it is yours. Some places I looked at said it was Russian, others said its origins are Greek, but then the rest of the webpage and all of my other searches just kept linking me back to the Hunger Games content and other Hunger Game names. So instead, I decided to break up the name into its parts. The prefix Mel has three potential interpretation. Mel could be Proto Indo European root meaning soft, with derivatives referring to soft or softened material. It forms all or a part of words like bland, mulch, and smelt. Another root meaning is strong, great, forming words like multiple and multitude. The third potential meaning is false, bad, wrong. Forms all or parts of a word like blame, blasphemy, malady, and malice. Meanwhile, lark can be in reference to obviously the songbird. And in literature, larks represent daybreak. For example, the lark was used to represent daybreak in Chaucer's The Knight's Tale and in Shakespeare's Sonnet 29. And the daybreak part reminds me of the symbolism from one line in the poem Lucy Gray by William Wordsworth, which is the poem that led me on this side tangent. But there it represents joyous freedom. Lark can also be in reference to Old English and Old Norse forms that suggested a contracted compound, perhaps meaning treason worker. And then there is the old proverb that goes, "When the sky falls, we shall catch larks," which is mocking foolish optimism. So, with all this in mind, what was Suzanne Collins possibly trying to show us with this character? I think Peeta matches the first two interpretations of the prefix Mel. He is both soft and strong, and his every action throughout the series can be interpreted as both. For example, when he gave Katniss bread and took the brunt of his mother's punishment, was he too soft to not do more and vocally stand up for himself to his mother or for others? Or was he strong for silently taking this because the punishment was worth it? Because his mother wasn't entirely wrong. They also needed to survive, and every material they use cost money. They cannot be wasteful. But to Peeta, sometimes it is worth the risk if it means giving to someone in desperate need, if you are able to. So was he soft-hearted for this sentiment, risking his family's potential economic decline if Katniss had been a different person and spread the word, leading to more standing outside their door for donations? Or was he strong for ignoring all the hypothetical risk to offer another human some needed kindness? You can have a similar argument to his outlook on the first games when he tells Katniss he is choosing to not truly participate. Katniss thinks to herself that maybe he is too soft for this, that his softness and refusal frustrates her. She expresses in the Hunger Games, Peeta Mellark, we will see how high and mighty he is when he is faced with life and death. He'll probably turn into one of those raging brute tributes, the kind who tries to eat someone's heart after they killed him. She thinks ill of him not for the first time. The thought passes her mind when she sees him crying on the train, only to convince herself it is an act. Peeta Mellark, on the other hand, has obviously been crying, and interestingly enough, does not seem to be trying to cover it up. However, despite Katniss thinking he'll act like everyone else or is playing it up as some sort of act, Peeta simply is attuned to his emotions, expresses them, but then was able to rise above them in his goal to get Katniss out alive. Proving his strength was because of his emotions to extend empathy towards others and even acknowledge the magnitude of the situation. But going back, Peeta not wanting to play their game might seem like he's too soft and cannot handle the game's brutality. But in reality, as we and Katniss later learn, Peeta is actually stronger than the rest of them for resisting to play their game. One of the things I feel that most people forget about is that he is not, because he is not the main character, is that Peeta is equally to blame for sparking the rebellion. He started the romance. He accepted the berries. He kept pushing the capital with his words and his paintings and his forms of inaction. His outright blasphemy, or pointing the blame on the right people, exposing the capital during his interviews, is reflected with the third definition of the prefix Mel. Yet, Peeta also brought hope, as shown with a conversation between Katniss and Gale and Mockingjay. They had to build up a rebel base in the capital, get some sort of underground organized in the districts. Then they needed someone to get the whole thing in motion. They needed you. They needed Peeta too, but they seem to have forgotten that. He just as much can be credited for being the daybreak, the new dawn on a new society, for being the sun that warmed and encouraged everyone else to rise and grow. He was hopeful. He believed in the possibility of a joyous freedom, just as larks often represent. However, just as with the old proverb using larks to mock foolish optimism, Peeta was foolishly optimistic, foolishly hanging onto a sliver of hope with him carrying the torch for Katniss, even when it seemed beyond foolish, for hoping his fellow men would choose kindness. And when the sky fell, the capital did catch its lark, imprisoning and torturing Peeta. In conclusion, as I have illustrated, both Gale and Peeta's last names act as a sort of foreshadowing to their characters' arcs and personalities. By looking into their potential meanings and symbolism, this process helped to flesh out both these characters even more for me. They already were well developed and complex characters, but by analyzing their names, I feel like I got a glimpse into what Suzanne intended for each of these characters. To me, it shows that she is a very thoughtful author, but also that this is obviously why this series is a modern classic. You could analyze this text a million different ways. You can look at how she is having a conversation about humans and war. You can look at how she's brilliantly took the ideas from philosophers we all briefly learned in school, but made them digestible by guising them as a fable sort of manner. You can look at it with a feminist lens or even an environmental one, which the latter is the lens I got to look at in one of my college classes. But as I demonstrated here, you could simply spend hours looking into all the characters' names and dissect them. I could not praise Susan Collins enough for this masterpiece. And the true brilliance of this work is that it is intended for a younger audience, unlike most books we read in school. This story can be enjoyed at any age because she never talks down to her readers and never underestimates what they can handle and understand. All I can hope for is that we see more books written like this, brilliant yet simple to understand, straightforward yet layered. A story that helps us as a society to understand complex topics and theories in a way that has us starting real conversations. A story that has sparked plenty of conversations and discourses over the 15 years. And I hope this video will spark even more. I would love to hear what you think about what I talked about these characters, or the story in general. And may the odds be ever in your favor.